I'm really excited to be here. I don't often get to talk to actual Pentecostals about Pentecostalism, so this is fun for me. You will probably know some of the stories I'm talking about as opposed to most of the people who hear me talk about Pentecostalism. Thank you, Dr. Uglow and Dr. McElhaney, for putting this together and for inviting me to join you. I'm, again, very excited to talk to you today. Over the last several months, a couple recent developments have made what I'm talking about this morning all the more important. Some things that have happened in the Assemblies of God alone make the issue of African Americans in the Pentecostal movement a very important issue for us to be aware of, to talk about, and to discuss openly. The first is that just after Thanksgiving of last year, 2013, the executive leadership of the Church of God in Christ, the oldest and largest African American Pentecostal denomination, or for that matter, the oldest Pentecostal denomination, met with the leadership of the Assemblies of God at the national headquarters in Springfield, Missouri. According to the official press release from the meeting, George Wood, the general superintendent of the Assemblies of God, reflected sorrowfully on the separation that had occurred between the two denominations in 1914 because of the racial culture at that time in America. Then, just 2 weeks ago, in February, George Wood signed an agreement of cooperative affiliation with Thomas Barclay, the presiding elder of the United Pentecostal Church of the Assemblies of God. For those of you who don't know, the United Pentecostal Church was actually founded in 1919 when Assemblies of God leaders would not ordain or credential an African-American minister who wanted to become a missionary to Liberia. The new agreement between the AG and the UPC will allow United Pentecostal churches to affiliate with AG districts and participate in national AG programs and missions efforts. These two recent events point towards the historic relationship between white and African American Pentecostals. In the early years of the Pentecostal movement, African American and white Pentecostals often worshiped together, fellowshiped together, and even ministered together, defying the increasing racial segregation of American society. These relationships, of course, were not always perfect, but they were very unusual for their time. In the early 1900s, you have to understand, whites and blacks rarely engaged one another in American society, and they never engaged one another as equals. When Pentecostalism began, America's churches had been strictly segregated for decades, and Pentecostals were very unusual in that their services incorporated both whites and African Americans. Now, unfortunately, as the story goes on today, you're going to see that this is a short-lived history, but it's an important history nonetheless. So this morning I want to talk to you about some of the major events and leaders in the early years of Pentecostalism, and especially the contributions of several African American leaders to the origins of the Pentecostal movement. And I'll be talking about three cities, basically. We're going to spend some time in Houston, Los Angeles, and Memphis to kind of see the formation, the beginnings of this movement. Now, I have no doubt that many of you, and most of you, are familiar with Azusa Street, one of the most famous episodes in Pentecostal history, and most of you have probably heard something about that story and the fact that there were whites and blacks worshiping together at Azusa Street. But the true story is that Azusa Street was not the first interracial encounter in Pentecostalism. That first encounter actually occurred in Houston, Texas. So the first interaction between white and black Pentecostals occurred in Houston in 1905 when Charles Parham initiated a citywide revival campaign in Houston. Parham had developed the doctrine of speaking in tongues as the initial evidence in Topeka, Kansas in 1901 while he was leading a small Bible school there. After several of his students began speaking in tongues, Parham traveled across Kansas and Missouri, spreading the news of this new spiritual experience. However, the opposition of other ministers and the local press kept Parham from achieving any huge successes in the Midwest. So in 1905, Parham hatched a plan to strategically target the city of Houston, the railroad hub of the Southwest, and from Houston, Parham planned to send Pentecostal missionaries across the state of Texas and eventually across the country and around the world. Now, I can't really emphasize enough the strategic strategy that Parham had in Houston. It wouldn't have the same scale as a Billy Graham crusade in the future or a Dwight Moody revival, but a lot of the elements were there nonetheless. He was very organized and strategic in how he wanted to target the city. So, for example, before he ever even entered the city, he was sending announcements of himself to the local newspapers, and these are printed in the local newspapers. And once he arrived and once the revivals began in Houston, they were covered regularly by the newspapers. There are hundreds of articles describing the Pentecostal movement and what was happening, and accounts of reporters visiting the revivals that are happening in 1905. For our own idea today, basically Parham's movement would have been trending on Twitter if it was happening in 2014. I mean, this is how important. Most of you probably haven't touched a newspaper in the last week, but for 1905 Houston, this was the most important way he could get across his movement. Beyond just the newspapers, Parham was also strategic in kind of attracting people to the movement. So, for example, his students would march through the streets of Houston before a meeting dressed in biblical costumes and holding up huge banners that would say Apostolic Faith, which was the name of their movement, across them. People would follow them to the meeting hall where Parham was going to speak, and as his students were sitting around on the stage, Parham would preach about some of the biblical robes that they were wearing at the time and use them as examples to tell these stories. He also liked to preach and give speeches on current events. So he talked about the temperance movement, he talked about Zionism, a homeland for the Jewish people, and one of the things he talked about was race relations in America. Now, Parham, like many of his white contemporaries, did not advocate race mixing. He was for segregation. He did not believe the races should mix in any way whatsoever. In fact, Parham argued that the flood in Genesis 6 was actually a punishment for interracial mixing and a warning to any who would do it in the future. But Parham was strategic, and he recognized that Houston had a large African-American population. In 1905, it was about 33% of the city's population. He wanted to appeal to these African-Americans, but he knew he needed a separate branch of his movement to organize them and to bring them together into the movement. Parham's plans for an African-American branch materialized through the efforts of his children's nanny, Lucy Farrow, who would become the first African-American we know of to join the Pentecostal movement. Farrow pastored a local African-American congregation in Houston, and she served as the Parham's governess during the week. While working for the Parhams, Farrow heard explanations about the doctrine of speaking in tongues, and she saw several individuals speaking in tongues. She herself began to speak in tongues during a trip back to Kansas in 1905, and when she returned to Houston, she began to tell other African Americans about her experiences. One of these individuals was William Seymour. Seymour was an African American pastor who was helping Farrow with her own church while she was away from Houston. Farrow told Seymour that Parham was beginning to start a Bible school in Houston and that Seymour should inquire about studying with Parham. So Seymour did what she said. He asked Parham if he could join the Bible school, and Parham agreed. Now, this is a story that has been told and retold in Pentecostalism about 1,000 times. And the story about Seymour has been told so many times by so many different people that we don't actually know what really happened anymore. Some folks say that Seymour sat outside the door that Parham left carefully ajar. Others say that there was a curtain hung in the room to separate the students and keep them from one another. And the story has been told and retold so many times that most Pentecostal historians at this point don't even footnote the story anymore. They just say it like it's fact. And this is a place where footnotes actually matter in an important way. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, these are the little things at the bottom of the books that your professors tell you to pay attention to. These are actually important. Because when we go back and we look through the footnotes of early historians of the movement, we find that the first record of Seymour being excluded in some kind of way was actually recorded by Charles Shumway, who was an undergraduate student in Southern California who wrote his senior thesis on Pentecostalism. Yes, your work here at SAGU can actually matter. This is an undergrad student writing a senior thesis. It's one of the most important works in the history of Pentecostalism. But the problem with the story is that Charles Shumway didn't really know whether the story was true or not. He based his evidence on his assumption that Southern segregation codes would have prevented Seymour from sitting in the classroom with white students. But the problem is that Houston had no code at the time, and even if Houston did have a segregation code about students in classrooms, it certainly would not have applied to a small Bible school being held in a private home with like 20-something students. So we don't know whether Seymour's in the classroom or not. Some other people have raised a lot of questions about whether Parham really had any influence on Seymour. and whether he was there long enough, because as we'll see, Seymour's going to leave after just a couple weeks to go to Los Angeles. But Parham himself believed that he only needed 21 days to teach you Pentecostalism and turn you into an evangelist. I'm sure a lot of you wish that your degree programs at SAGU were 21 days and not 3, 4, 6, 8 years, something like that. But Parham and Seymour's relationship is a case in which life and history get messy and complicated. It would be real simple to say that Parham was a racist, and he was. His public statements, his writings, his personal correspondence all conveyed a negative view of African Americans and other races. Parham believed that African Americans should be subordinate to whites and white leadership. And so although he welcomed Seymour into his Bible school, his ultimate plan was to develop a segregated and subordinate African American branch of his organization. And Seymour wasn't excited about being subordinated to Parham in all things. And we're going to see when he goes to Los Angeles that he wants a group and a place of equality for all peoples. But Parham wasn't alone in these views. Most of white America in 1905 would have agreed with Parham, and numerous other denominations had African American branches of their organizations that were overseen by whites. But despite the racism and negativity which Parham espoused, Seymour found a kernel of truth in Parham's message, and when he was invited to pastor a congregation in Los Angeles, he left Houston and embarked on a journey that would reshape the Pentecostal movement. Seymour arrived in Los Angeles in 1906 to pastor a small African-American holiness congregation. While Seymour's new congregants agreed with him on the need to be committed and holy in the eyes of God, they were not as excited about his teachings on speaking in tongues. In fact, Julia Hutchins, who had been the leader of the group before Seymour's arrival, was actually offended by Seymour's teachings on tongues. She believed that the doctrine of tongues implied that she had not received the fullness of the Spirit in the same measure. So, to keep Seymour from spreading what she believed was a doctrinal error, Hutchins actually padlocked the doors of the church and asked the local leadership of the movement to intervene. Seymour could not convince Hutchins or the leadership of the truth of Spirit baptism, so he relented and began holding prayer meetings at the home of Richard and Ruth Asbury at 214 Bonnie Bray Street. And as the meetings grew in attendance, the group relocated to the former African Methodist Episcopal Church, which had been most recently used as a stable at 312 Azusa Street. And you'll see on the left up there a picture of 312 Azusa Street. That picture is actually taken in the 1920s. But you can see the doors at the bottom of the building that were not actually accessible when it was originally an African Methodist Episcopal Church. They're actually a set of stairs in front of the church, and we have pictures of folks from the original congregation standing on those stairs because you can see the vaulted door at the top that was the original entrance to the original church. And on the right-hand side, there's a picture of the leadership at Azusa Street Church, which is quite diverse. Gender diversity, racial diversity, even age diversity. We have a young child pictured in the leadership picture. It was a very interesting place. And that's what was most unique about the house on Bonnie Bray Street and the mission on Azusa Street was the interracial mixing that was occurring there. Although the congregation that invited Seymour to Los Angeles had been exclusively African American, the Azusa Street revivals were a mixture of black, white, Latino, Asian, and a variety of other nationalities and ethnicities. In fact, after commenting on the unusual practice of speaking in tongues, the presence of blacks and whites in the same worship space was usually what most outsiders noticed. Reporters from several Los Angeles newspapers visited the revivals and they commented on the meetings. They described the participants as colored people and a sprinkling of whites, who were led by an old colored exhorter. They noted several occasions in which whites who appeared wealthy and well-educated were found worshiping alongside the African-American congregants, something that was quite scandalous at the time. The reporters liked to give very colorful language to describe Pentecostals. They described their worship as screeching, barking like dogs, and making the night hideous with their yells and squeals. One of the women speaking in tongues, and this is my favorite description, one of the women was likened to an old speckled hen who'd laid an egg in the corner of the barn and wanted everyone to know it. But Seymour and his congregation paid little attention to the press coverage. They were completely comfortable with the interracial character of their group. Azusa's newspaper, The Apostolic Faith, commented, "Although the work began among the colored people, God makes no difference in nationality. Ethiopians, Chinese, Indians, Mexicans, and other nationalities worship together." Another article claimed, "No instrument that God can use is rejected on account of color or dress or lack of education. All were welcome at Azusa Street, and all were considered equal participants in the experience of Pentecostalism." Now, this doesn't mean that Azusa Street ignored difference. They certainly recognized difference, but in the pages of the Apostolic Faith, they rarely, if ever, use the word colored, black, white, or Caucasian. They refer to people by language, by ethnicity, by nationality, but they don't use these kind of barriers that were dividing people at the time. Differences existed, but they were never a reason for breaking fellowship. Whether the coverage of Azusa Street was negative or positive, it certainly made it a quite notable experience. And the notoriety increased, and eventually interested pastors, missionaries, and lay people from across the United States began traveling to Los Angeles to witness the phenomena. Parham had tried for years to expand the influence of his movement, but it was Seymour who sparked the exponential growth of Pentecostalism. One of the most significant people to attend the movement was a man named Charles Harrison Mason. Now, Mason was the founder of a group in Tennessee and Mississippi known as the Church of God in Christ. It was a predominantly African-American denomination. Mason and his companions arrived in Los Angeles in March 1907, 10 months after the revivals had begun. And although some of them were critical of the movement, Mason was extremely interested in what was happening there, and he began to pray for the ability to speak in tongues. After what he described as much soul-searching and internal struggling with the devil, Mason remembered, "When I opened my mouth to say glory, a flame touched my tongue, which ran down in me. My language changed, and no word could I speak in my own tongue." Like many of his colleagues, Mason experienced spirit baptism, and his religious life was never the same afterwards. When he returned to Memphis, he found that a white evangelist from Azusa Street, a guy named Glenn Cook, had already been holding meetings at his home church while he was away. And so many of his congregants had already accepted the doctrine of spirit baptism. So Mason continued to teach the doctrine. And people reported that often Mason would be preaching and just spontaneously begin to speak in tongues and continue preaching and then go back to English. Sometimes he would even break out into songs in tongues as well. Now, some of his congregants weren't exactly comfortable with this new practice. And so whereas in Los Angeles, people had locked Seymour out of the church, in Memphis, they actually take Mason to court. They sue for rights to the church property, claiming that Mason has diverted from the original doctrines of the church. Mason claims that the original doctrines of the church were always the Bible, and since speaking in tongues is in the Bible, he was perfectly legitimate in his claims. The Tennessee Supreme Court actually heard the case and agreed with Mason. And so there was a split in the Church of God in Christ over the issue of speaking in tongues. Mason's church in Memphis would become a vital part of the African-American community there. As it grew, it became an important center of African-American life in Memphis. And actually, after the original tabernacle burnt down, they built a new building in the middle of World War II. It was dedicated in 1946. And at its time, it was the largest owned meeting hall for the African-Americans owned in the United States. So when a sanitation strike breaks out in 1968 in Memphis in the middle of the civil rights movement, and you needed to have a meeting place, where did you go? Mason Temple. And when Dr. Martin Luther King would come to Memphis to speak to the sanitation strikers on April 3rd, 1968, he would speak at Mason Temple the night before he was assassinated. So it becomes a very important place for the African-American community. But even more so, it becomes important for the Pentecostal movement because Mason does something that's very unusual, not just for Pentecostals, but for religion in America in general. Mason, as an African-American, invites whites into his organization. And so he actually ordains and brings white leadership into the organization. The Constitution of the COGIC Constitution 1907 declared in a section titled Equal in Power and Authority that many denominations have made a distinction between their colored and white members, and this has led to misunderstandings and has caused the organizing of many separate colored denominations. The Church of God in Christ recognizes the fact that all believers are one in Christ Jesus, and all its members have equal rights. Its overseers, both colored and white, have equal power and authority in the church. And so several individuals, white individuals, came and were ordained by Mason, became members of his church. One of the most prominent was actually a pastor in Memphis named Leonard P. Adams, who pastored a local church in Memphis called Grace and Truth Church of God in Christ. Grace and Truth would remain a COGIC church until 1923, when it would join the Assemblies of God and become First Assembly of God, Memphis. And so there's a historic tradition between some of these churches in very specific ways. Adams himself declared that although his church was predominantly white, he claimed that the congregation did not restrict membership based on race. And he himself often preached to African-American congregations and attended Mason's African-American church. So in 1907, when a scandal erupted in Texas and Parham's leadership was under debate, a group of leaders stepped up to begin kind of leading the Texas group that had emerged out of Houston. And they were leading it rather collectively, much like what our general or executive presbytery looks like today. There was no single leader, they were leading kind of as a group. And in 1912, they began to raise questions about the name of their group. First of all, because the name had been coined by Parham, and there were some questions about Parham and whether they should have ties to him. But many of them started to raise questions about whether the name apostolic faith was biblical at all. One of them asserted, "Nowhere in the Bible is a congregation of believers in Christ called a mission, nor an apostolic mission. So why don't we join with the Bible and with many of the Pentecostal and apostolic saints everywhere and call our congregations churches of God and churches of God in Christ?" And that's exactly what they did. So in 1913, the former Apostolic Faith Church in Fort Worth began being recognized by the Fort Worth Star-Telegram as a Church of God in Christ. Now, not every church changed its name, but a lot of them did. But this name, of course, doesn't come out of nowhere. It's very clear and very evident that these white pastors knew Mason, knew Mason's church and his organization, knew the name Church of God in Christ, and they have borrowed it from them. In fact, in 1910, Howard Goss had traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, and met with Leonard P. Adams, the white pastor I just mentioned, and participated in meetings at his church. And Adams very obviously probably told him about Mason and the name Church of God in Christ. Now, of course, the story goes, and we all kind of know how the story ends. A few years later, these same white Pentecostals who'd taken the name Church of God in Christ would call for a meeting in Hot Springs, Arkansas, to organize the General Council of the Assemblies of God. Now, a lot of people have raised questions about whether racism played any part in their decision to separate from COGIC. In my opinion, the separation isn't really that drastic to begin with. They were borrowing the name, some of them were ordained by Mason, but there really was no organizational ties, there was no legal arrangement. Mason was never exercising authoritative control over these white leaders. In fact, at the founding meeting of the Assemblies of God, Mason actually travels to Hot Springs and brings a choir from his church to kind of bless the meeting and what's happening there and the fact that the Assemblies of God is beginning. The separation was certainly not designed with a racist intent, but it did nonetheless accept what I mentioned that George Wood had said, that the racial culture of America at the time was in place. So in 1925, when Frank Bartleman wrote in his memoirs describing the scene at Azusa Street, he coined the now infamous line, "The color line was washed away in the blood." Now, the truth is that while Bartleman may have wanted to be prophetic, he really wasn't. The color line wasn't washed away, and we would go on for decades of issues and problems and divided denominations over the issue of race. But maybe what we're seeing now is the beginnings of the move back, and that color line is beginning to fade away a little bit more. Thank you very much.